There are a few contenders for the crown of the greatest year in Hollywood history. A good case can be made for 1999, which saw American Beauty, The Matrix, Blair Witch Project, The Sixth Sense, Toy Story 2, Iron Giant, The Talented Mr. Ripley, Being John Malkovich, Magnolia, The Green Mile, and Office Space. Some have argued for 1977, the year that produced Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Suspiria, Eraserhead, Airplane, and Saturday Night Fever. Or 2001, the year of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, The Fellowship of the Ring, Mulholland Drive, The Royal Tenenbaums, Spirited Away, Shrek, Monsters Inc., Amelie, Moulin Rouge, Zoolander, Donnie Darko, and the remake of Ocean's 11. Or 1989, with The Little Mermaid, When Harry Met Sally, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Batman, Dead Poet Society, My Left Foot, Do the Right Thing, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and Glory. Or 1994, with The Lion King, Forrest Gump, The Professional, Dumb and Dumber, Four Weddings and a Funeral, Ed Wood, Natural Born Killers, Pulp Fiction, Clerks, and The Shawshank Redemption. But traditionally, the crown for Hollywood's greatest year has belonged to 1939. For sheer quality and diversity of output, it is hard to argue that any other year has put out such a large number of not merely great films, but truly iconic ones. Two of the unarguably greatest movies of all time came out in 1939, Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, both released by MGM. These films both transcended being merely great movies to become part of the basic cultural vocabulary of the modern West. Even people who have never seen either one at least know of them, and inadvertently quote them regularly, whether they're not in Kansas anymore, or frankly, they don't give a damn. Laurence Olivier gave gravitas to the best ever version of Wuthering Heights. Basil Rathbone started his stint as the best ever Sherlock Holmes in Hound of the Baskervilles, and Lon Chaney Jr. and Burgess Meredith were perfectly cast for the best ever adaptation of Mice and Men. John Wayne broke through as a Western superstar in John Ford's epic Stagecoach, and James Stewart perfected his stumbling everyman persona in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The Marx Brothers could be found at the circus. Humphrey Bogart did his only horror role in Return of Dr. X. Buck Rogers leapt from newspaper strips into a 12-part serial. The Son of Frankenstein brought the monster and the Universal Monsters franchise back from the dead, and the Fleischer Brothers produced the first non-Disney feature-length animated film with Gulliver's Travels. Goodbye Mr. Chips, Ninotchka, Dark Victory, Jamaica Inn, Honolulu, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Cecil B. DeMille's Union Pacific, just simply too many films to mention. And of course, while King Kong was far behind it and Citizen Kane was yet to come, RKO made several key contributions to Hollywood's greatest year. Laurel and Hardy returned in The Flying Deuces. The biopic Nurse Edith Cavell, starring Anna Neagle, received an Oscar nomination for Best Score, but lost to Wizard of Oz. RKO's Love Affair was up for Best Picture and Best Art Direction. Its star Irene Dunne was up for Best Actress, and co-star Maria Ouspenskaya, most famous for her later role in The Wolfman, was up for Best Supporting Actress. But all four awards were lost to Gone with the Wind, Vivien Leigh, and Hattie McDaniel. Any other year, and Love Story might have won. It's a charming film in its simplicity and restraint. Irene Dunne plays an American singer engaged to a businessman stateside. Charles Boyer plays a debonair French womanizer en route to New York to wed a wealthy heiress. Unfortunately, they are sailing on the same ocean liner and ignite embers of a reserved romance. They know they can't even be seen together lest the newspapers talk, but following a visit to the idyllic home of his grandmother, played by Ouspenskaya, on Madeira, they cannot help but give in to their mutual affection. There is the slight problem of their respective fiancés, but the two make a pact to meet again in 6 months at the top of the Empire State Building, both to give them time to settle their affairs with their fiancés and prove to themselves that they have what it takes to survive on their own, as working people without the wealth their fiancés promised. But then tragedy strikes, not in the form of a giant ape at the pinnacle of the world's tallest skyscraper, but on a road at the base of it. Dreaming of her rendezvous, the absent-minded Dunn walks into traffic and is struck down by an automobile, handicapped and confined to a wheelchair. The remainder of the movie is a waltz of subtle hurt, pride, missed opportunity, restrained emotion, and reconciliation that is masterful within the genre of Golden Age Hollywood film. Love Affair isn't the broad strokes of impassioned lovers throwing themselves into each other's arms, to its credit. It is a grown-up love story. And as I said, any other year and it might have won the 4 Oscars it was nominated for. But 1939 was stiff competition, and Gone with the Wind was a Hollywood juggernaut, even in Hollywood's greatest year. 1939 saw many brilliant and incomparable casting choices. Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff, Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes, Lon Chaney Jr. as Lenny Small, Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable as Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler, Judy Garland as Dorothy Gale. One of the standout castings in a year of standout castings was Charles Laughton in RKO's Hunchback of Notre Dame. Laughton is rightly considered one of the greatest actors of all time, if somewhat underrated today. After an accomplished career on the British stage and in British silent pictures, his first Hollywood role was in Universal's thriller The Old Dark House, alongside Boris Karloff and Raymond Massey, under the direction of James Whale. Not a bad introduction to American film. Laughton also played Nero in Cecil B. DeMille's The Sign of the Cross, Dr. Moreau in Island of Lost Souls, Javert in Les Miserables, Captain Bligh in Mutiny on the Bounty, and he received an Oscar for Best Actor for the title role in The Private Life of Henry VIII. But short of Captain Bligh, Laughton is best known today for his portrayal of Quasimodo. In fact, when Universal Studios themed one of their recent Halloween horror nights around a Parisian setting, their version of the Hunchback looked unmistakably like Laughton's instead of Chaney's. RKO's version had a circuitous history that began at Universal in 1932 as a sound remake of their classic 1923 version starring Lon Chaney Sr. Laughton had already been a part of those discussions, coming off his role in The Old Dark House. That version never materialized, and Universal sold the rights to MGM, who in turn sold the rights over to RKO. Unfortunately for RKO, since they didn't have access to Universal's replica of the Cathédrale Notre Dame de Paris, they were required to build their own on their ranch in the San Fernando Valley. And it worked. One would be hard-pressed to find the differences between it and Universal's replica, though the effect of plaster and lathes doesn't quite match the stonework of the original cathedral. It's an important effect to achieve, as the cathedral itself is the dominant character of Victor Hugo's sweeping novel on which both films were based. Despite films identifying with the cathedral's malformed bell ringer, the novel's actual title is simply Notre Dame de Paris. It is a powerful romantic drama about the people who live in the shadow of the cathedral, which is to say, in the shadow of the late Middle Ages, and a time of monumental social upheavals that mirror the decade of the 1820s in which it was written. It is, in fact, one of my favorite novels, with one of my favorite literary characters in the complex Claude Frollo, about one of my favorite places. I consider the actual Cathedral of Notre Dame to be my spiritual home away from home, my favorite place on earth built by human hands, and perhaps the dominant aesthetic, historical, and religious symbol of my life. Alas, that I must live an ocean and a continent away from her. Unfortunately, Hollywood has regularly lacked the courage to properly and fearlessly adapt Hugo's novel. It is a French novel, after all, which means that it does not end happily. Optimistic Americans trying to satisfy a matinee audience have rarely, if ever, tried to get the story right, including RKO's 1939 version. The question for each version is, then, what does it get right unto itself? What redeeming virtues it has that make it a good film on its own grounds, apart from comparisons to the novel? I've never been able to fully forgive the Disney version in this regard. It attempts to turn Hunchback of Notre Dame into a tepid musical in the vein of Les Miserables, and except for the animation and character designs, it largely fails in the task. Universal's 1923 version largely succeeds on two fronts: the cachet of being a silent film, and the grand, even massive scale on which that silent film is executed. RKO's version actually succeeds by going in the opposite direction. Despite building their own replica of the cathedral, it's a film on a much smaller scale, focused more closely, literally and figuratively, on the faces of the characters, and in particular on Quasimodo, for whom Lawton performs a tour de force. Compared to the sensitivity of Lawton's version, all other Quasimodos are somewhat clownish. Lawton also has the benefit of being the first sound hunchback. When he intones that he is as shapeless as the man in the moon, and wonders why he could not be made of stone like the cathedral's chimera, we too are overcome with Esmeralda's conflicting feelings of pity and horror. RKO's Hunchback of Notre Dame also benefits from its historical context. The complexity of Hugo's views on the transition from the medieval to the Renaissance are given a shallow, pigeon version here, flattened into a simple historical myth of upward progress befitting the 1939-40 New York World's Fair, dubbed the World of Tomorrow. But 1939 was also the outbreak of the Second World War. This gives a vital subtext to the film's themes of a persecuted racial minority and the fight against injustice and tyranny. For as incredible casting as Charles Laughton was for Hunchback of Notre Dame, RKO also made a rather incomprehensible casting choice for their other most significant film of 1939, Gunga Din. Based loosely on the eponymous poem by Rudyard Kipling and his short story Soldiers 3, it stars Cary Grant opposite Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Victor McLaglen as a trio of boisterous, brawling, roguish British sergeants fighting Tuggee hordes in the Khyber Pass, by way of California's Alabama hills. Though certainly roguish, Cary Grant was by no means a brawler. His epitome of glamour and sophistication, applied most often to screwball comedy, embodied, in the words of a Variety reporter, a distinctive kind of non-macho masculinity. While Grant has all the movie's best lines, the role doesn't fit well with his persona, and early fight sequences in sped-up time are themselves too comedic. McLaglen was the actual professional boxer, and fight scenes really ought to have been left up to him. Fairbanks was given a few minor acrobatic sequences for which his father was famous, and oddly enough, for a native son of England, Grant's British accent is the worst of the bunch. He arrived in the United States at the age of 16, and his accent quickly morphed into the famed transatlantic accent of Golden Age Hollywood. His Cockney accent is, weirdly, filtered through his transatlantic one. Gunga Din is one of those imperial British adventure stories without the adventure. At least, not adventure in the action-packed Tarzan King Kong mold. There's a lot of barracks room banter and riding around, only really picking up at the end, when Grant's treasure-hunting scoundrel falls into a trap at the gold-laden Tuggee Temple. But worse than that is the injury the film does to Kipling's poem. It is written from the point of view of a British soldier in India, describing the troops' abuse of their water carrier Gunga Din. By the end, the poem lionizes him as an heroic figure for his tending to the needs of others at the ultimate sacrifice of his own life. Gunga Din is lauded as a better man than I am by the British soldier, who, like Jesus' parable, hopes that his thirst in hell will be slaked by the saintly figure. One of Kipling's surprisingly nuanced views on the British imperial project. Kipling was a Chanticleer of the Empire, but his work is more complex and imbued with more realism than he is often given credit for. Kipling sympathizes with the common soldier in a way that your average, inexorable chicken hawk would never think to. He criticizes both the false jingoism that puts soldiers' lives in unnecessary peril and the classist criticism from those insulated from the affairs of the world on Britain's fair shores. And in the case of Gunga Din, Kipling acknowledges the implicitly satanic mission of the colonial soldier and praises the quote-unquote heathen, colonized Hindu as an agent of life. The film, on the other hand, has Dean aspiring to become a soldier and dying an heroic death to save our three protagonists and avert a Tuggee trap for the regiment, subverting Kipling's own themes even as an actor portraying Kipling writes the poem's famous closing lines. Nevertheless, the film was inducted into the National Film Register in 1999, and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. considered it his best movie. For Grant, it was just one of several movies he made while splitting his time between RKO and Columbia Pictures. In our next installment, we'll have a look at the films of Cary Grant, including one of the best cult comedies of all time, Bringing Up Baby.